Does exposure to media violence cause violent behavior? Yes, say social scientists in hundreds of published studies. No, argue their critics. The controversy has raged for decades as violence in the media grows ever more violent.
You probably thought you weren't going to die today. Surprise!
Alongside a growth in violence by kids, even in some of our wealthiest and fastest growing communities.
We see a 10% increase in our population on almost any given year. Conversely, we see those crimes that are committed by children up significantly more than 10%. And I would say that window is probably between 20 and 28, 30%.
Now, a team of researchers is looking at the controversy from a new perspective. Using technology that allows them to see inside the brain itself, they are discovering how media violence changes brain function.
We decided to look at the relationship between media violence exposure and brain processes that were thought to be responsible for self-control, attention, and concentration. And these are things that have been called executive functioning. And we thought that would be a good place to start.
In phase 1 of their research, they selected 2 groups of test subjects: normal adolescents.
One group we called a control group. These were adolescents who had no history of past violent or aggressive behavior and really had not seen a mental health professional.
And adolescents diagnosed with a disruptive behavior disorder.
They're adolescents who meet a strict psychiatric diagnosis for either conduct disorder or oppositional defiant behavior. And so they're children who are diagnosed with disruptive behavior disorder with aggressive features.
Interviews and psychological testing revealed important differences.
Adolescents with more aggressive behavior reported more media violence exposure than adolescents with less aggressive behavior. Adolescents with more past media violence exposure showed lower scores on measures of attention, concentration, and self-control.
Phase 2 of their research introduced functional magnetic resonance imaging.
The way that functional MR works is when you use a part of your brain, that part of the brain requires more energy, and to get that energy, there's more blood flow to that area. And it's the blood flow that we're really looking at with MRI. A new thing was to look at the effect of violent media exposure to see how that played a role in the brain activation or the way the brain worked during these psychological tests, and whether that violent media exposure worked the same on the aggressive kids as it did on the normal kids.
They focused on the frontal lobe, an area of the brain responsible for attention, concentration, and self-control, the so-called executive functions involved in thinking and learning. Brain scans showed important differences in brain activity between the 2 groups. Normal adolescents had more activity in front lobe areas. Adolescents with disruptive behavior disorders showed less activity in the same areas. Further tests found important differences in brain functioning, even among the normal group.
If we stratified the normal kids into 2 groups, a high media violence exposure group and a low media violence exposure group, we also found differences in the way their brain activated. And the kids who were exposed to a lot of violent media, whether that be video games, TV, movies, that sort of thing, their brains actually worked similar to the aggressive kids.
In phase 3 of their research, they tested normal adolescents to determine if violent or non-violent video games made a difference in their brain function.
We randomly assigned the subjects to either play a violent video game or an exciting non-violent video game, and then immediately took them into the MRI scanner and had them perform what are called Stroop tasks. These are tasks that involve concentration, inhibition, and attention. One of the tasks actually involved emotional stimuli as well. So we were able to test not only concentration and self-control, but also emotional reactivity. And what we found was that the group that played the violent video game demonstrated more activation in areas of emotional arousal, an area called the amygdala, whereas they showed relatively less activation in the prefrontal lobes, and those are areas that are involved with self-control, concentration, and attention, inhibition, those sorts of things. We term those executive function.
What does this mean for parents?
Our research has shown that there is a relationship to violent video game play and brain function.
This is a wake-up call for them to be aware of what their children are doing and be concerned about it and possibly restrict how much is being used. I don't think that's unreasonable based on what we've done so far.
On a practical basis, I would recommend to parents to limit the amount and the degree of exposure to violent media, including television, video games, and movies.
The predominance of violence on TV, the video game culture, I think is very disturbing. And when you can kill a policeman, I find that to be very, very disturbing. I believe, from my experience here, that violent crime amongst youth will continue to increase unless there's significant social change.
What can you do to protect your children? Contact us at sosparents.org.